Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be talking about the worst maritime disaster in Philippines history. I am of course talking about the MV Dona Paz, otherwise known as Asia's Titanic, the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in human history. And somehow, you've probably never heard of it. Let's get into it, but first, thank you so much for watching. It's December 20th, 1987, and Salvador Pascal, a local fisherman along with his 18-year-old daughter, is boarding a ferry heading home for the holiday. He's joined not only by his daughter, but also an estimated 4,000 others will also be sailing aboard with him. He's sailing on an old Japanese ferry designed to carry only 1,400. On paper, it was said that they were only carrying about 1,583 passengers, but in reality, it was more like the aforementioned 4,000, which is absolutely insane to think about. Can you just imagine people packed together in hallways and staircases on the roof of the cabin? Somewhere else in the same stretch of ocean, on the Tablas Strait between Mindoro and another place which I cannot pronounce, there's another ship cruising along. This ship is called the MT Vector. This isn't a passenger ferry, it's an oil tanker carrying 8,800 barrels of gasoline and petroleum from Caltex, Philippines to Manila. Now you'd think a boat carrying that amount of gasoline and petroleum would be diligent, at the very least qualified with trained crew, good safety gear, and again have a real captain. But unfortunately, you'd be wrong. The Vector wasn't just unsafe, it was a floating accident waiting to happen. No licensure, no maintenance, and no real captain at the wheel. Yes, that's correct. The captain sailing the boat was just some guy with no license. Oh my gosh. Oh. Imagine strapping a few thousand gallons of gasoline to a ship, which was quite frankly falling apart, and then pointing it out to the middle of the ocean full of people. And of course, they didn't do it on purpose, but still, they were traveling in a very popular shipping lane. If you go back and you read the full accounts, we're basically asking for it. At 10 p.m., the Dona Paz passengers were settling in. Kids were running around the length of the ship. People were singing karaoke, which for those who don't know is very popular in the Philippines, which I think is really cute unless it's 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm trying to sleep. Then someone on the bridge sees a light on the horizon around 10:07. Unfortunately, these lights were coming straight at him, too fast for much to be done. At 10:10 p.m., there was a horrendous crunching of metal as the two ships collided. People were thrown off their beds, jerked out of their seats, and they spilled the milk which they were drinking, which I know is nothing to cry about, but what would come next certainly was. In an instant, gasoline spilled into the water, and the ocean itself began to catch fire. Survivors said it looked like a sea made of lava. Within seconds, both ships were swallowed in flames. The Dona Paz interior became an oven. No working alarms, no life vests, and no crew members either to help. Panicked people began jumping overboard into the burning water. Some were able to cling to debris, but with the ocean surrounding them completely on fire, they quickly either burned or drowned. One survivor, Arnel Galag, 18 years old, said this: "After jumping from the ship, I saw it engulfed in fire. It rotated maybe twice, and I saw it slowly sinking. In less than 2 hours, Dona Paz was gone. Thousands gone with her. No SOS was ever sent. Why? Because the ferry's radio wasn't working. For 8 hours, no one even knew what had happened. Few remaining survivors bobbed aimlessly for what must have felt like an eternity before the next morning. By the next morning, a passing ship found survivors, but unfortunately, there were only 24 of them who were picked up, 21 of them from the Dona Paz and 3 from the Vector. Out of an estimated 4,386 souls, only 24 would survive to tell the tale, 2 of them being Salvador Pascal and his daughter. His retelling of the story is certainly something out of a nightmare. I ran back to my daughter. It didn't take longer than 2 minutes for the smoke to get into our quarters, and suddenly had the hunch to jump into the water with her. Should be noted, when he jumped overboard, Pascal landed into a pool of fiery oil that had burned his face and his arms. Pascal continued his account by saying, "My daughter heard my voice and she shouted, 'Papa, I am here.' I went up to her and asked if she was okay." Pascal also said he found a boy about 3 years old floating in the sea. "I had to let go because he was dead. Everything happened so fast, I didn't even hear a lot of crying. Most people were asleep, and after a while, everything was so quiet. Bodies later washed up along the coast of Mindoro. The families burned and charred." That's the kind of number I can't even visualize. It's the population of a small town, gone overnight. The investigation that followed was a lot what you would expect. A lot of finger pointing, a lot of corporate shrugs. The Philippine Board of Maritime Industry blamed both ships. The Vector's owners were guilty of running an unsafe, unlicensed tanker with unqualified crew, and the ferry company was slammed with overcrowding and lack of safety. Caltex, whose fuel was basically the bomb that started this, got off legally and scot-free. In the end, the families got a tiny settlement because the maritime law capped liability at the ship's declared value. So in simple terms, a human life was worth less than a seat on a ferry. If you want to understand why people were so furious, this is why. The newspapers called it Asia's Titanic, but honestly, that doesn't even cover it, as more than twice as many died than on the Titanic. And unlike the Titanic, there were no violence, no distress calls, no romantic tragedy, just fire, bureaucracy, and the disaster that forced the government to promise reforms, better inspections, stricter training, and emergency drills. Some changed, but not enough. Even the 2000s, overloaded ferries were still sinking. So did they learn their lesson? Maybe. Halfway. For those who lived through the event, that meant carrying that night with them. Arnel Gell says that the flames still show up when he closes his eyes. Some tried to keep going. A new job, new routines, pretending December 20th is just another day. For families who never found a body, each December they meet at a memorial, set candles, and they say the names of those who they've lost. The waves roll in, and for a moment, you can almost hear that night again. Panic, a quick prayer, and a fire. So what does it all mean? Because this isn't just a story about ships. It's a story about neglect, how systems can rot when nobody cares until it's too late. The Dona Paz tragedy happened because everyone assumed someone else was responsible for it. The crew assumed that management knew what they were doing. Management assumed that the regulations were being watched. And regulators assumed someone else would fix it. And in the end, thousands paid for the price of everyone else's convenience. When you break it down, the Dona Paz isn't just a maritime story, it's a story about how easy it is to ignore danger when it doesn't affect you directly, and how fragile safety is when profit becomes the priority. If you ever find yourself sailing across the Philippines, look out over the blue calm sea. Beneath it lies the wreck of the Dona Paz, still resting there after nearly 40 years. The water looks peaceful, but history says otherwise. Thousands boarded that ferry expecting an ordinary trip home. Only 24 returned. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as a distant tragedy, but as a warning, because the most dangerous thing about history is thinking that it can't happen again. This has been the MV Dona Paz story, a fire at sea, a symbol of neglect, and a lesson in how fragile life can be when no one else is paying attention. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay safe, stay curious, and I will see you in the next video.